You are listening to the audiobook edition of Glimpses of World History, written by Jawaharlal Nehru and first published in 1934. This audio presentation has been created by Giribala Joshi using advanced text-to-speech technology.
Chapter 43, Harsha-Vardhana and Hiuen Tsang. May 11, 1932. We shall go back to India again. The Huns have been defeated and driven back, but many remain in odd corners. The great Gupta dynasty fades away after Baladithya, and there are many kingdoms and states in northern India. In the south, Pulkeshin has established the Chalukyan Empire. Not far from Kanpur is the little town of Kanauj. Kanpur is now a big city, but an ugly one with its factories and chimneys, and Kanauj is a modest place, hardly bigger than a village. But in the days of which I speak, Kanauj was a great capital, famous for its poets and artists and philosophers, and Kanpur was still unborn, and was to remain unborn for many hundreds of years. Kanauj is the modern name. The real name is Kanyakubja, the hunchbacked girl. The story is that some ancient sage or rishi, made angry at a fancied slight, cursed the 100 daughters of a king and made them hunchbacked. And since then the city where they lived was called the City of Hunchbacked Girls, Kanyakubja. But we shall call it Kanauj for short. The Huns killed the Raja of Kanauj and made his wife Rajshri a prisoner. Thereupon Rajshri's brother, Harsha-Vardhana, came to fight the Huns and rescue his sister. He defeated them, but was treacherously killed. The younger brother, Harsha-Vardhana, now went out to search for his sister Rajshri. The poor girl had managed to escape to the mountains and, overcome by her sufferings, had decided to end her life. It is said that she was on the point of becoming a sati when Harsha found her and saved her from this. Having found and rescued his sister, the next thing Harsha did was to punish the petty Raja who had killed his brother treacherously. Not only did he punish him, but he succeeded in conquering the whole of northern India, from sea to sea, and up to the Vindhya mountains in the south. Beyond the Pandyas was the Chalukyan Empire, and Harsha was stopped by this. Harsha-Vardhana made Kanauj his capital. Being himself a poet and dramatist, he gathered round himself a host of poets and artists, and Kanauj became a famous city. Harsha was a keen Buddhist. Buddhism, as a separate faith, had weakened greatly in India. It was being swallowed up by the Brahmins. Harsha appears to have been the last great Buddhist sovereign in India. It was during Harsha's reign that our old friend Hiuen Tsang came to India, and the book of his travels that he wrote on his return tells us a lot about India and the countries of Central Asia which he crossed on his way to India. Hiuen Tsang's name is also spelt Hiuen Tsang or Yuan Shuang or Hiuen Tsang. He was a pious Buddhist, and he came to visit the sacred places of Buddhism and to take with him the scriptures of the faith. Right across the desert of Gobi he came, visiting many a famous city on the way. Tashkent, and Samarkand, and Balkh, and Khotan, and Yarkand. All over India he traveled, perhaps even visiting Ceylon. His book is a strange and fascinating jumble of accurate observations of the countries he visited, wonderful character sketches of peoples in different parts of India which seem true even today, fantastic stories which he heard, and numerous miracle stories of the Buddha and the Bodhisattvas. One of his delightful stories, about the very wise man who went about with copper plates round his belly, I have already told you. Many years he spent in India, especially in the great university of Nalanda, which was not far from Patliputra. Nalanda, which was a monastery and university combined, is said to have had as many as 10,000 students and monks in residence. It was the great center of Buddhist learning, a rival to Benares, which was the stronghold of Brahmin learning. I told you once that India was known of old as the land of the moon, Induland. Hiuen Tsang also tells us about this, and describes how suitable the name is. Apparently even in Chinese Indu is the name for the moon. So it is quite easy for you to adopt a Chinese name. Footnote: Indira's pet name is Indu. End of footnote. Hiuen Tsang came to India in 629 AC. He was 26 years old when he started on his journey from China. An old Chinese record tells us that he was handsome and tall. His coloring was delicate, his eyes brilliant. His bearing was grave and majestic, and his features seemed to radiate charm and brightness. He had the majesty of the great waters that surround the earth, the serenity and brilliance of the lotus that rises from the midst of the waters. Alone, in the saffron garb of the Buddhist bhikshu, he started on his mighty journey, even though the Chinese emperor had refused him permission. He crossed the Gobi Desert, barely surviving the ordeal, and reached the kingdom of Turfan, that stood on the very edge of this desert. A strange little oasis of culture was this desert kingdom. It is a dead place now where archaeologists and antiquarians dig for old remains. But in the 7th century, when Hiuen Tsang passed through it, it was full of life and a high culture. And this culture was a remarkable combination of India, China, Persia, and even bits of Europe. Buddhism flourished and Indian influence through Sanskrit was marked, and yet the ways of life were borrowed largely from China and Persia. Their language was not Mongolian, as one might expect, but Indo-European, resembling in many ways the Celtic languages of Europe. And, stranger still, on their frescoes in stone appear figures that are similar to European types. Very beautiful are these frescoes with their Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and gods and goddesses. The goddesses often have Indian draperies or Grecian headdresses and draperies, presenting, so says the French critic M. Grousset, the happiest combination of Hindu suppleness, Hellenic eloquence, and Chinese charm. Turfan still exists, and you can find it on the map. But it is a place of little importance. How wonderful it is that in the far-off 7th century rich streams of culture should have flown from distant regions to meet here and unite to form a harmonious synthesis. From Turfan the pilgrim Hiuen Tsang went on to Kutcha, yet another famous center of Central Asia then, with a rich and brilliant civilization, known especially for the fame of its musicians and the charm of its women. Its religion and art came from India, Iran contributed to its culture and to its merchandise, and its language was related to Sanskrit, Old Persian, Latin and Celtic. Another fascinating mixture. And so Hiuen Tsang traveled on through the lands of the Turks from where the great Khan, who was a Buddhist, exercised dominion over the greater part of Central Asia, to Samarkand, which was already then an ancient city with memories of Alexander, who had passed by it nearly 1,000 years earlier, to Balkh, and then the valley of the Kabul River, and Kashmir and India. These were the early days of the Tang dynasty in China, when Xianfu, their capital, was a center of art and learning, and China led the world in civilization. You must remember, therefore, that Hiuen Tsang came from this highly civilized country, and his standards of comparison must have been high. His testimony about Indian conditions is thus important and valuable. He praises the Indian people and the administration. With respect to the ordinary people, he says, although they are naturally light-minded, yet they are upright and honorable. In money matters they are without craft, and in administering justice they are considerate. They are not deceitful or treacherous in their conduct, and are faithful in their oaths and promises. In their rules of government there is remarkable rectitude, whilst in their behavior there is much gentleness and sweetness. With respect to criminals or rebels, these are few in number, and only occasionally troublesome. He further says, as the administration of the government is founded on benign principles, the executive is simple. People are not subject to forced labor. In this way taxes on people are light and the personal service required of them is moderate. Each one keeps his own worldly goods in peace, and all till the ground for their subsistence. Those who cultivate the royal estates pay a sixth part of the produce as tribute. The merchants who engage in commerce come and go in carrying out their transactions, and so on. Hiuen Tsang found that the education of the people was organized and began early. After the primer had been learnt, the boy or girl was supposed to begin the study of the 5 Shastras at the age of 7. Shastras are now supposed to mean purely religious books, but in those days they meant knowledge of all kinds. Thus the 5 Shastras were 1. Grammar, 2. Science of arts and crafts, 3. Medicine, 4. Logic, 5. Philosophy. The study of these subjects went on in the universities and was usually completed at the age of 30. I suppose not very many people could go on up to that age. But it appears that primary education was comparatively widespread, as all the monks and priests were the teachers, and there was no lack of them. Hiuen Tsang was much struck by the love of learning of the Indian people, and right through his book he refers to this. Hiuen gives us a description of the great Kumbh Mela at Prayag. Footnote: Prayag is the old name for Allahabad. Mela is a fair. End of footnote. When you see this Mela again, think of Hiuen Tsang's visit to it 1,300 years ago, and remember that even then it was an old Mela coming right down from the Vedic times. Compared to this ancient one, of hoary lineage, our city of Allahabad is but of yesterday. It was founded by Akbar less than 400 years ago. Far older was Prayag, but older still is that attraction which, for thousands of years, has drawn millions, year after year, to the meeting place of the Ganga and the Jumna. Hiuen Tsang tells us how Harsha, though a Buddhist, went to this typical Hindu festival. On his behalf an imperial decree invited all the poor and needy of the 5 Indies to come and be his guests at the Mela. It was a brave invitation, even for an emperor. Needless to say, many came, and 100,000 are said to have fed daily as Harsha's guests. At this Mela, every 5 years, Harsha used to distribute all the surplus of his treasury, gold, jewelry, silk, indeed everything he had. He even gave away his crown and rich clothing and took from his sister Rajshri a common garment which had already been worn. As a pious Buddhist, Harsha stopped the killing of animals for food. This was probably not objected to much by the Brahmins, as they had taken more and more to vegetarianism since Buddha's coming. There is a little tidbit of information in Hiuen's book which might interest you. He tells us that when a person fell ill in India he immediately fasted for 7 days. Most people recovered during this fast. But if the illness continued, then they took medicine. Illness could not have been popular in those days, nor would doctors be much in demand. A striking feature of India in those days was the great deference and respect shown by rulers and military men to learned and cultured people. In India and in China a deliberate attempt was made, and with great success, to give the place of honor to learning and culture, and not to brute force or riches. After spending many years in India, Hiuen Tsang journeyed back home, crossing again the northern mountains. He was nearly drowned in the Indus and many of his valuable books were washed away. But still he managed to take a large number of manuscripts, and the translation of these into Chinese kept him busy for many years. He was welcomed back with great warmth by the Tang Emperor at Xianfu, and it was this emperor who made him write the account of his travels. Hiuen tells us of the Turks he met in Central Asia, this new tribe which in later years was to go west and upset many a kingdom. He tells us of Buddhist monasteries all over Central Asia. Indeed, Buddhist monasteries were to be found in Persia, Iraq or Mesopotamia, Khorasan, Mosul, right up to the frontiers of Syria. Of the Persian people, Hiuen tells us that they care not for learning, but give themselves entirely to works of art. All they make the neighboring countries value very much. Wonderful travelers there were in those days. Even the journeys to the heart of Africa or the North or South Pole now seem feeble compared with the giant journeys of old. For years they moved on, across mountains and deserts, and cut off completely from all friends. Sometimes, perhaps, they felt a little homesick, but they are much too dignified to say so. One of these travelers, however, lets us have a glimpse into his mind as, standing in a distant land, he thought of home and hungered for it. His name was Sung Yun, and he came to India 100 years before Hiuen Tsang. He was in the mountain country in Gandhara, northwest of India. He tells us that, the gentle breeze which fanned the air, the songs of the birds, the trees in their springtide beauty, the butterflies that fluttered over the numerous flowers, all this caused Sung Yun, as he gazed on this lovely scenery in a distant land, to revert to home thoughts, and so melancholy were his reflections, that he brought on a severe attack of illness. End of chapter 43, titled, Harsha-Vardhana and Hiuen Tsang. Chapter 44, South India produces many kings and warriors, and a great man. May 13, 1932. King Harsha died in 648 AC. But even before his death a little cloud appeared on the northwest frontier of India, in Baluchistan, a cloud which was the forerunner of a mighty storm that was breaking in Western Asia, Northern Africa and Southern Europe. A new prophet had arisen in Arabia, and Muhammad was his name, and he had preached a new religion called Islam. Fired with zeal for their new faith, and full of confidence in themselves, the Arabs dashed across continents, conquering as they went. It was an amazing feat, and we must examine this new force which came into the world and made so much difference to it. But before we consider it, we must pay a visit to South India and try to make out what it was like in those days. The Muslim Arabs reached Baluchistan in Harsha's time, and soon after they took possession of Sindh. But there they stayed, and for another 300 years there was no further Muslim invasion of India. And when this invasion came, it was not the doing of the Arabs, but of some of the Central Asian tribes who became converted to Islam. So we go to the south. In the west and center there is the Chalukyan kingdom, largely consisting of the Maharashtra country, with Badami as their capital. Hiuen Tsang praises the Maharashtrians and speaks highly of their courage. They are warlike and proud-spirited, grateful for favors and revengeful for wrongs. The Chalukyans had to hold Harsha in the north, the Pallavas in the south, and Kalinga, Orissa, in the east. They grew in power and spread from sea to sea, and then they were pushed away by the Rashtrakutas. And so, big empires and kingdoms flourished in the south, sometimes balancing each other, sometimes one of them growing and overshadowing the others. Under the Pandyan kings, Madura was a great center of culture, and poets and writers of the Tamil language gathered there. Most of the classics of Tamil date from the beginning of the Christian era. The Pallavas, whose capital was Kanchipuram, the modern Kanjivaram, also had their day of glory. They were largely responsible for the colonization of Malaysia. Later, the Chola Empire grew to power, and about the middle of the 9th century it dominated the south. It was a sea power and had a big navy, with which it swept the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. Its chief port was Kaveri-Puttanam at the mouth of the Kaveri River. Vijayalaya was their first great ruler. They went on spreading north till the Rashtrakutas suddenly defeated them, but they recovered soon under Rajaraja, who restored the Chola fortunes. This was near the end of the 10th century, just about the time when Muslim invasions were taking place in northern India. Rajaraja was, of course, little affected by what was happening in the far north, and he carried on his imperialist ventures. He conquered Ceylon, and the Cholas ruled there for 70 years. His son Rajendra was equally aggressive and warlike. He conquered southern Burma, taking his war elephants with him in his ships. He came to northern India also and defeated the king of Bengal. The Chola Empire thus became very extensive, the biggest since the days of the Guptas. But it did not last. Rajendra was a great warrior, but he appears to have been cruel, and he did nothing to win over the states he had conquered. He reigned from 1013 to 1044, and after his death the Chola Empire broke up, many of the tributary states revolting. Apart from their success in war, the Cholas were long famous for their sea trade. Their fine cotton goods were much sought after, and their port, Kaveri-Puttanam, was a busy place, with ships carrying merchandise coming from and going to distant places. There was a settlement of Yavanas or Greeks there. There is mention of the Cholas even in the Mahabharata. I have tried to tell you, as briefly as possible, about several hundred years of South Indian history. Probably this attempt at brevity will only confuse you. But we cannot afford to lose ourselves in the maze of different kingdoms and dynasties. We have the whole world to consider, and if a small part of it, even though it may be the part where we live, took up much of our time, we would never get on with the rest. But more important than the kings and their conquests is the cultural and artistic record of those times. Artistically, there are far more remains in the south than the north has to offer. Most of the northern monuments and buildings and sculptures were destroyed during the wars and Muslim invasions. In the south they escaped even when the Muslims reached there. It is unfortunate that numerous beautiful monuments were destroyed in the north. The Muslims who came there, and remember they were the Central Asians and not the Arabs, were full of zeal for their religion and wanted to destroy idols. But another reason for their destruction was perhaps the use of old temples as citadels and fighting places. Many of the temples in the south even now seem to resemble citadels where people can defend themselves if attacked. These temples thus served many purposes, apart from that of worship. They were the village school, the village meeting place, panchayat ghar, or parliament, and finally, if this became necessary, the village fort for defense against the enemy. Thus all the life of the village revolved round the temple, and naturally the people who must have bossed over everything were the temple priests and Brahmins. But the fact that temples were used sometimes as citadels may explain why the Muslim invaders destroyed them. Of this period there is a beautiful temple at Tanjore built by Rajaraja, the Chola ruler. At Badami there are also fine temples, so also at Kanjivaram. But the most wonderful of the temples we have of those days is the Kailasa temple of Ellora, a marvel carved out of the solid rock. This was begun in the second half of the 8th century. There are also beautiful pieces of sculpture in bronze, notably the famous Natraj, Shiva's Dance of Life. Rajendra I, the Chola king, had remarkable irrigation works constructed at Cholapuram, an embankment of solid masonry, 16 miles long. 100 years after these were made, an Arab traveler, al-Biruni, visited them and he was amazed. He says of them, "Our people, when they see them, wonder at them and are unable to describe them, much less construct anything like them." I have mentioned in this letter the names of some kings and dynasties, who lived their brief life of glory and then disappeared and were forgotten. But a more remarkable man arose in the south, destined to play a more vital part in India's life than all the kings and emperors. This young man is known as Shankaracharya. Probably he was born about the end of the 8th century. He seems to have been a person of amazing genius. He set about reviving Hinduism, or rather a special intellectual kind of Hinduism called Shaivism, the worship of Shiva. He fought against Buddhism, fought with his intellect and arguments. He established an order of sannyasis open to all castes, like the Buddhist Sangha. He established 4 centers for this order of sannyasis, situated at the 4 corners of India, north, west, south, east. He traveled all over India, and wherever he went he triumphed. He came to Benares as a conqueror, but a conqueror of the mind and in argument. Ultimately he went to Kedarnath in the Himalayas, where the eternal snows begin, and he died there. And he was only 32, or maybe a little more, when he died. Shankaracharya's record is a remarkable one. Buddhism, which had been driven south from the north, now almost disappears from India. Hinduism, and the variety of it known as Shaivism, becomes dominant all over the country. The whole country is stirred up intellectually by Shankara's books and commentaries and arguments. Not only does he become the great leader of the Brahmin class, but he seems to catch the imagination of the masses. It is an unusual thing for a man to become a great leader chiefly because of his powerful intellect, and for such a person to impress himself on millions of people and on history. Great soldiers and conquerors seem to stand out in history. They become popular or are hated, and sometimes they mold history. Great religious leaders have moved millions and fired them with enthusiasm, but always this has been on the basis of faith. The emotions have been appealed to and have been touched. It is difficult for an appeal to the mind and to the intellect to go far. Most people unfortunately do not think, they feel and act according to their feelings. Yet Shankara's appeal was to the mind and intellect and to reason. It was not just the repetition of a dogma contained in an old book. Whether his argument was right or wrong is immaterial for the moment. What is interesting is his intellectual approach to religious problems, and even more so the success he gained in spite of this method of approach. This gives us a glimpse into the mind of the ruling classes in those days. It may interest you to know that among Hindu philosophers there was a man, named Charvaka, who preached atheism, that is, who said that there was no God. There are many people today, especially in Russia, who do not believe in God. We need not enter into that question here. But what is very interesting is the freedom of thought and writing in India in the olden days. There was what is known as freedom of conscience. This was not so in Europe till very recent times, and even now there are some disabilities. Another fact which Shankara's brief but strenuous life brings out is the cultural unity of India. Right through ancient history this seems to have been acknowledged. Geographically, as you know, India is more or less of a unit. Politically she has often been split up, though occasionally, as we have seen, she has almost been under one central authority. But right from the beginning, culturally she has been one, because she had the same background, the same traditions, the same religions, the same heroes and heroines, the same old mythology, the same learned language, Sanskrit, the same places of worship spread out all over the country, the same village panchayats and the same ideology and polity. To the average Indian the whole of India was a kind of punyabhumi, a holy land, while the rest of the world was largely peopled by Mlayakshas and barbarians. Thus there rose a common Indian consciousness which triumphed over, and partly ignored, the political divisions of the country. Especially was this so as the village system of panchayat government continued, whatever the changes at the top might be. Shankara's choice of the 4 corners of India for his mutts, or the headquarters of his order of sannyasis, shows how he regarded India as a cultural unit. And the great success which met his campaign all over the country in a very short time also shows how intellectual and cultural currents traveled rapidly from one end of the country to another. Shankara preached Shaivism, and this spread especially in the south, where many of the old temples are Shaiva temples. In the north, during Gupta times, there was a great revival of Vaishnavism and Krishna worship. The temples of these two branches of Hinduism are different from each other. This letter has become long enough. But I have still to say much about the condition of India during these Middle Ages. That must wait till the next letter. End of chapter 44, titled, South India produces many kings, and warriors, and a great man.